Thanks everyone for coming along. I've got a lot to cover today, and I'm also due in a panel right after this talk, so I'm going to just dive right into it. And there might not be time for questions at the end, but feel free to come and find me later or at the panel. Just going to start a timer so I keep track. Great. Okay, so very quickly about me. I'm currently the manager of the analytics team at Pickpock, but really how I came to be here, my background is a mixture of science, so formally educated in science, but I've been a lifelong game designer, developer, analyst. Fun fact, here's the first game I ever developed, which is a mod for Warcraft 3 called Sheeptag, and there was a whole community developing this, not just me, but that was what I spent most of my teenage years doing. I'm very lucky to combine both my passions for kind of science and data and creativity in my professional life. And I've been lucky to work across kind of a suite of different studios, from small little studios, publishers, to currently being a Pickpock. I've worked across all platforms, all types of games. Next slide. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about analytics, and I'm not going to go into anything statistics or too complex or too technical, but I'm not going to go over the 101 kind of what's retention, ARPDAU, LTV, etc. All these things are really important to the success of your game, but today I'm going to talk about the belief that I have that data is simply a language to describe the world around us, and that is a tool that can be used for creative purposes as well as the more kind of businessy aspects. And I'm going to show you some practical ways that we use data in game development and maybe inspire you to do the same. Okay, so why do I want to talk about this? Well, very briefly, I sometimes kind of come across this notion from people that data and creativity don't synergize well or somehow oppose each other. Sometimes this is quite subtle, sometimes it's quite blatant. People think that analytics is just for the business side of things. So I'm hoping to dispel that myth, kind of challenge some of those beliefs and show you how really data and creativity can work together to make great games. Okay. So I'm going to start just introducing the concept of behavioural data because we're going to be talking about this a lot. So behavioural data is a representation of the choices that your players make in the game. So probably everyone in this room here is involved in some way in developing a game. And I want you to think about how you want your players to experience your game. What is your intent as a designer or whatever your part is in that? And now imagine watching a player play the game over their shoulder. Have a think about what sort of choices do they make. So what do they do? Where do they go? What items do they pick up? What choices do they make? What happens to them then? What feedback do they get back from the game? And then how do they react to that? So what's the story of your player experiencing the game? And think about recording these behaviours. This is what we do in behaviour analytics. So if you were in the same room watching this person over their shoulder, you might record their screen. You might make some notes in a notepad. If you have 10 to 50 people, you might do that, but you might have a standardized form that you collect that data in. If you've got hundreds and thousands of people that you want to see how they're behaving in your game, this is where analytics comes in. So you can automate that capture of observations about your players, and you can record it all in a database somewhere. And it might be in a database now, but the behaviour that it represents is the same as if you were watching them play. Okay, so we're going to quickly go through an example. Hopefully everyone's familiar with Dark Souls. A disclaimer, I haven't worked on it and I've not actually played it, but I've seen plenty of people who have. So the intended experience behind Dark Souls, I looked this up online, and the sentence that I got back was that they wanted as many players as possible to experience the joy that comes from overcoming hardship. Okay, that's quite an interesting idea. And hardship in Dark Souls tends to come in the form of getting whomped by some boss, right, many times. And so some of the basic behaviours that you might watch for in your players is, well, what do they do after they die? Do they try again? Do they quit in a rage? Do they go somewhere else in the game, trying to avoid that boss? And if they do try again, are they getting better? Is there evidence that they are overcoming that hardship next time, right? Do they manage to deal more damage next time, take less damage? Do they manage to dodge the boss's moves and parry their attacks? All of these things are behaviours that you can track with analytics. And if they're not behaving in the game in the way that you intended as the designer or as part of the creative team, you really might want to think about, well, why are they not? Why is that? What's the problem here? Something else that you might observe is things that detract from the experience. These may be necessary parts of the game. So in Dark Souls, after you die to a boss, you end up at a bonfire and you have to run back. And you might want to give the players enough time to reflect on what happened in the last boss fight, but if it takes too long and it's too repetitive and too tedious, it's going to detract from that experience of the joy of overcoming hardship. And a classic one is like, are they waiting for things to load? Is that breaking their immersion? So the process here is to think about what your intended experience is, what would that look like in terms of player behaviour, and then measure those player behaviours. Okay. Now, that was quite a simple example of like some basic behaviours, but the story that this data can tell will gain more nuance over time. So not all players are the same. Different segments will emerge throughout the data. So some common ones are, new players versus experienced veteran players. They're going to have very different behaviour. They'll experience the game differently. And there are some other ones that are maybe more subtle, like different motivations, players who kind of just run in and like to slash things versus players who are maybe more carefully considered and min-max their build before they go back in. You can see all of that in their behaviour, and you'll find that these kind of different groups emerge. The other aspect of this is that games are obviously complex. They're made up of lots of different systems that interact each other. And the more you learn about how players experience or interact with all those different systems, the more nuance you'll have to explain other things that you're seeing. So one example of this is, this is a horse from Rival Stars Horse Racing. This is a pin-pop game about horse racing, horse riding, horse lifestyle. And over time, we've released more and more different breeds of horses into the game. Some of them are more popular than others with players. And over time, because we understand how players interact with different game modes, different live events, some players are really interested in the beautiful coats. Other players are just interested in being at the top of the leaderboard. Understanding the data from all of those systems helps add a lot more nuance and explanation to the reasons why different horses are more or less popular. Okay, so the point here is that you can combine data in kind of different ways to gain more information and more insight. Okay, so now that you have this tool, so you're collecting this data and you know how to read the language, what are some ways that you can use it? I'm going to go over a few examples. Okay, so I don't know out of everyone in this room what your level of experience is with data and analytics, but if you think, where do I start, right? Typically, the most effective places to use this information are to think about the aha moments in your game. So as a creative, you've probably got an idea of like, what's that magic moment that players are going to experience and they're going to get hooked into this game and they're going to want to keep playing. Generally, you want to drive players to that moment quite quickly, and you want to remove any obstacles that might get in the way of that. So that's a really good place to start. You also want to focus on high-frequency experiences. Sometimes these are part of that like core magic of your game, and sometimes they're not, but they're very necessary. So players might be looking at, inventory management screens all the time. And it's not really part of the core fun that you're trying to deliver, but it is a necessary part of the game. In those cases, you want to make those as frictionless as possible so that they don't become detractors. And you also want to focus on things that you're actually going to change. So don't waste your time looking at data if you think that no matter what result I saw, this has got to stay this way. Okay. Another place where I advocate for using data is thinking about cognitive biases. So a cognitive bias is a systematic and quite predictable error in the way that human brains do reasoning that can lead you to incorrect conclusions. And this happens to all humans in all walks of life. It's just kind of the way that our brains function. But data can be a really good tool for kind of combating these inbuilt biases. So I'll go over a couple of examples. One of these that you all will have seen is confirmation bias. So as humans, we simply just tend to seek out information which confirms our existing beliefs, and we're less likely to seek out information that opposes our beliefs. This is really natural, and you'll see it all the time, especially if you spend any time on social media, for example. The key thing here is to be aware of it. So write down what is your own belief, and write down alternative or opposing beliefs, and make sure that when you go to look at your data, you're looking for data that could support any one of those, so you're keeping an open mind. Another one is sometimes referred to as the curse of knowledge, and you'll see this often in game development. We tend to vastly overestimate how well versed other people are in our products, especially our players. So if you find yourself saying things like, obviously players know they need to go here to complete this mission, that's an opportunity to kind of reality check yourself and have a look at the data. Does it really show that players behave that way and that they know that? And something that's just quite interesting to do is to compare your own data with that of the average player, and you'll typically find that your experience playing the game is not really anything like theirs. And a third one, it's kind of similar to confirmation bias, is called availability bias. So we tend to favour information that comes to mind quite quickly, and this might not be the most relevant information. It might just be something that you heard recently, for example. So again, it's just being about intentional and making sure you're aware of what was the first assumption that came to my mind. Write that down, but write down a few other possibilities or a few other explanations and have a look at the data for all of those. So all of these boil down to making your existing assumptions explicit so that you can examine them, keeping an open mind when you're using the data. Okay. So does this kind of remove your creative freedom? Well, no, not really. You're still free to make whatever decision that you want at the end of the game and at the end of the day, and to make whatever game that you want. But hopefully, if you're intentional about using these tools, you're just a little bit more informed about whether your opinion lines up well with actual player behaviour. And you're still free to act on your intuition, but over time, your intuition and your mental model might change a little bit. So you might break and reshape your model to have it become closer to the player experience. You might add more detail or nuance that you might have previously missed. And ultimately, I believe your ideas are better once they've been challenged. So even if you still make the same decision or you don't change your idea, you've gone through the process of it being challenged, and looking at the data can be a bit like bouncing ideas off a second designer who's there to kind of offer a different opinion. Okay. Moving on. Another place where data is really helpful is in creative brainstorming and problem solving. So this here is an image of the old store page from Rival Stars Horse Racing again. It's a free-to-play game, so it has this market screen where you can go and buy currency, you can buy horses, buy items, things like this. And this is how it had been since launch, but the team, a couple years after launch, wanted to revisit it. They weren't totally happy with it. Some of the thoughts that we had going into this originally were that the navigation was maybe a bit clunky. So you play the game in landscape, but this was like a vertically scrolling screen, and we weren't really sure if that was obvious to players. We weren't honestly sure if players were going to the market screen. Like, do they want to do that? And we did believe that this was kind of the go-to place to buy or spend premium currency, so it might be a little risky to make dramatic changes. We don't want to break the in-game economy. So we went away, we did some research, we looked at what other games were doing, we did some brainstorming, and in that brainstorming we included some behavioural data that we had from analytics. So I'm going to talk you through that. Okay, these were some of the facts that we found when we looked at the data. So over 80% of daily active users were visiting this store page. I thought, okay, that's not bad, right? We don't need to waste our time and energy trying to get more players to go to this page. They're already doing it. We found that about 60% of players would scroll halfway down the screen. And so that was interesting because that did mean that there was a group of players missing out on these really awesome horses, right? Some of our best, most desirable content. They were never seeing it. And so there is some evidence to support that players didn't really know that they could scroll down the screen. We got some insights about where players were going to the market from. So what were they trying to do before they visited the store? And it gave us an idea of what their motivations might have been. And finally, probably the most interesting thing we found was that only 12% of users spent premium currency in this store screen. So the vast majority of all premium currency being spent, about 85%, was spent elsewhere in the game. So in the breeding area or the training area or the racing area. And this meant two things. So firstly, it really kind of freed us a little bit from the fear of messing things up by changing this screen. It gave us a little bit more creative room, if anything, to make changes. We weren't too worried about damaging the economy. And what it really revealed was some interesting questions that we wanted to answer. So if 80% of users are looking at the screen, but only 12% of them are buying anything, are we really showing them the content that's relevant to their needs at that time? And are we making sure that they understand the value and the desirability of that content? So, everyone was involved in this brainstorming, all the designers, artists, creative and analytics alike. But adding the data did a few things. It helped us be aware of things that we simply didn't know before. It helped us add definition and detail where we were lacking specific information. And it helped us rule out problems that we just didn't need to worry about. Okay, so the point here is that data expands creative brainstorming and it doesn't replace it. It's just one tool that you might take into a discussion or brainstorming or problem-solving meeting to provide additional context. And a core advantage of data is that it can tell you something about the world that you didn't know before. So it'd been very hard to kind of intuitively guess what percentage of people knew they could scroll down the screen or how much premium currency is being spent there, but it's very trivial to just measure that with analytics. So yes, sorry, just referring back to my notes. It can help expand the ideas and facts that are explored in brainstorming, and can also help you narrow down on what is actually the right problem to solve for players. But none of this really takes away from the rest of the creative process. Okay. And finally, we're actually doing pretty well for time. I'll slow down a little. Have lots of water. So finally, I want to talk about approaching game development as a series of experiments. Okay, and I like to advocate for the idea that when you release a new feature or a new update to users, you never really know what's going to happen, how it's going to land, okay? So by that definition, it sort of already is an experiment, and you can treat it like one. And this, again, is another area where data really excels in helping you. There are specific mechanics for how you might want to do this, things like A/B testing or split testing. I'm not going to talk about those in detail, but I will go through an example. Okay. Match 3 games, Candy Crush Saga. I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with these. This is a case study from David Nelson, who was the Vice President of Experimentation at King at the time when they added a feature called hard level labeling to the game. So, Match 3, as a background, right, it's all based around the difficulty curve of the game. Gradually increases, but it has these really hard spikes in difficulty where players spend their resources, their boosters, etc. And then it's kind of interspersed with some relatively easier levels to keep users in the flow and to keep churn rates down. So it's really all about optimizing this difficulty curve. Now, originally, players didn't know what the difficulty was of each level. You would just click play, you get the next level. Someone on the team at King had the idea of adding this UI, just this simple purple border around the level screen, calling it out as hard. And when this idea was brought up, there were really two different camps in the development group. So some people in the team thought that telling the players a level was going to be hard would make everyone leave the game. Okay, it's a casual game. Players don't really want difficulty. They don't want to have to use forward-looking strategy about where they spend their resources. So that's what some people believed. Some of the other developers thought that having this hard level labeling might reduce churn, because if players know that a level is going to be difficult, then they'll be kind of primed to try it more times and not give up. So both of these are quite reasonable arguments, and you may have all been in situations like this where there's two different opinions, two different voices in the development team. Both sound pretty reasonable. You can't prove one wrong or right. And these discussions can go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Often they'll just end in a stalemate, and whatever the status quo is will win. But that's not what happened at King, because King embraced experimentation. And what they did is they ran an experiment. So they built this very simple border, this very simple user interface, and they released it to a group of their players, kept the other group with the original interface. And they did this because they knew that looking at the behavioural data would tell them how players experienced this change and how they responded to it. They didn't have to try and guess. And then they were free to learn from this and change their minds if they wanted to, because as I said, if you treat game development as a series of experiments, it's ever evolving. You can change your mind. So what did they see? Well, spoilers, you might already know this, but what they saw was that engagement went up across every level. Hard level labeling contributed millions of dollars, if not more, to the revenue across the puzzle game genre, and this is now a standard feature across pretty much any puzzle game that you'll pick up. So huge success. They got reviews from people saying, I'm sat next to my partner in bed and we're both playing the game and they've got hard levels. Why don't I have those? People really wanted this content and they were surprised at the time. But they updated their beliefs. So players do relish the accomplishment of beating hard levels. Having this hard level warning did allow players to attempt the level more times before giving up. And as a bonus, it also primed users to spend more of their boosters because they believed the level was going to be difficult. So it's kind of a win-win-win for Candy Crush Saga. Okay. So, experiments allow you to harness creative conflict that otherwise might just go nowhere. And they also give you the freedom to take creative risks, knowing that the data will tell you the impact of those risks and allow you to change your mind later on. So some general advice that I give is to try to aim for high impact and generalizable outcomes if you're going to be running experiments. Ideally, you should be using A/B testing or split testing for accurate and reliable results. I'm not going to go into that, but feel free to ask me about it later if you wish. And the key here is really to go beyond asking, was this idea right or wrong? Like, did this UI do good or do bad? You're really wanting to see if you can learn a deeper insight about your players that you can reuse elsewhere. Okay. Great. So I've sort of dumped a lot of information there, I feel, but I'll wrap up with some final thoughts. So again, I want us to bring us all back to the idea that data is simply a language that you can use to describe the world around you, and that is useful for creatives, for analysts, for product people, whatever your role is. I would encourage you all to try integrating data into your existing creative processes, no matter what they are. And the key thing is that it's not just for reporting a bunch of numbers on a dashboard. The goal is to make impactful changes to your product and ultimately to help you craft great games. And that's it. Okay, how are we doing? Have we got about 5 minutes left? If anyone has any burning questions, I might be able to answer 1 or 2 before I've got to dash. Yes.
Yes, you touched on this when doing A/B tests, the difference in the player base, like the example with the husband and wife having different, the feature of the hard mode and non. Are there any best practices in regards to this, like being how open you are with the changes to the community, bringing up like, oh, how come I had this and this other one has that? Like, yeah, any best practices in that?
Yeah, good question, because that's a very common fear with like A/B testing, is that some players are going to be upset that they get one version or the other. Generally speaking, you don't want players to know that they're in a test. So if you sort of follow the rules of scientific experiments, they're meant to be kind of blind, right? You don't want the fact that they know they're in a test to alter their behaviour. And for the most part, from what I've seen, most players are completely oblivious to what's happening. In fact, everyone in this room, you're in probably hundreds of A/B test buckets right now across products that you use all over the web and all of the games that you play. Some players do pick up on it, and that's where we really rely on our community and CS experts to figure out what's the right way to talk to those players. And I think it can be quite individual, and it can really depend on what you're testing. This is much likely to be a bigger issue if you're testing something that gives someone a competitive advantage or a perceived competitive advantage or something like that. So you do want to carefully consider, like, is this fair? Is this going to potentially lead to complaints? But I think a lot of the time, the fear of that happening is much bigger than, what we actually have. And I've run hundreds of A/B tests over my life, and it's never, knock wood, like blown up into a big problem.
Thank you.
Yeah. One more?
Thanks for the talk. So just wondering, when it comes to collecting data from players, I'm wondering if there's a threshold that you'd be able to tell us about in terms of at what point do you need to actually have disclaimers and like more legal notification and that kind of thing in terms of we are now collecting your data, and you need to have basically like a privacy policy or something to that effect?
Good question. Yeah, so the privacy and legal landscape is sort of ever evolving, and you do need to be really aware of that. So from the data that we collect in-game from our products, I think it is mentioned in our EULA, our disclaimer, and the reason we collect it is basically for the improvements of those products. What that means is that we are intentionally very respectful of players' privacy, so we typically don't collect any personal information. Like, I really only care about what your behaviour is in the game. I don't care so much where you live or what your name is or what gender you are. So the best thing to do is to really make sure you're only collecting the data that you need. And for game development purposes, it's often not any personal data. Where that can be more prevalent is for things like relating to user acquisition and marketing and understanding which channels are bringing you users and things. But there's sort of a ever-evolving set of best practices there that you can rely on. But you really don't need to be tracking anything invasive, so I would never advocate for that. Yeah.
So I guess in terms of if you needed to make players aware that you're tracking this data, if it's not personal information, if it's just game relevant information, then you can just collect the data as you will, and you'll generally not need to you won't have a need to create a privacy policy or put a disclaimer up or anything.
I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I would say definitely have a privacy policy and definitely make sure it's included in your EULA somewhere. But I couldn't speak to the specifics of that. You'll probably want to get legal advice. But yeah, we're not trying to hide this from players or mislead players, so they can find this. There's a privacy policy on our website and things like that.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we might need to wrap up there because I've got to dash to another talk. But thanks for coming. And if you have any other questions, feel free to just grab me later on.